like to continue the discussion among the panelists. You know, for most people, getting lost in the details of the balance of payment statement isn't what they're worried about. What they want to know is, do trade deficits go with less employment and less economic growth in the United States? So, I mean, Rob, you had said that when you were undersecretary and putting out the monthly trade deficit figures, it was in the midst of an economic boom. What does economic research and history tell us about relationship between trade deficits and economic growth, or trade deficits and overall employment? Anybody who wants?
Well, I just was going to say that actually recently I tweeted a picture of U.S. growth and U.S. trade deficits, and the correlation is close to zero and not significant. And exactly for the reason that was stated, that in really good times, you have high demand and you might import a lot. You might even be importing intermediates to go into your production to help you be more efficient. So during good times, you actually tend to run trade deficits, and they help to slow your growth so you don't overheat. But during bad times when you're running trade deficits, there may be some cost. We do need to recognize that. It is a drag on growth. But over the long history, there's no correlation between growth and the trade deficit.
Let's just think about our own lifetimes, or the lifetimes of the older ones in this room like me. You know, we had the lowest unemployment and the strongest growth in the last 60 years, in the 1960s and the 1990s. In the 1960s, we were running trade surpluses. In the 1990s, we were running trade deficits, which just is an illustration of Carolyn's point. It's not to say that there aren't elements underlying trade deficits or trade surpluses that affect growth. Of course there are, but they work in both directions. As I pointed out, for example, the trade deficit increases the supply of capital in the United States, which in turn lowers our interest rate, which in turn tends to increase growth. We know there are some negative effects on growth. There are also positive. In economics, almost all phenomena work in both directions.
I think that the notion that we've had a lot of growth with trade deficits and poor growth with trade deficits and the reverse and so on and so forth only illustrates my original argument that we have a lot of identities, and it's easy to grab an identity and then draw an arrow in one direction or another. With regard to the most recent trade deficits, I think we have to look at how markets have functioned and how political entities have responded to those markets. In recent years, with China's entry into the WTO and increased imports from China, people have been displaced. I don't think anybody can deny that people have lost jobs because of increased imports. The question is, what happens to them? Many have dropped out of the labor force, or their successors, their children who would have taken those jobs, have not participated in the labor force or to the same degree. That's a labor market adjustment problem. Now, we also have to consider how government entities have responded. There's been a substantial increase in the safety net to assist those people, and although the government has tried its hands in training them, it hasn't been very successful. So if we have a situation where we have more imports, people lose their jobs, but they don't adjust, you are going to reduce the gross national product, and you are going to reduce growth. I didn't shake my head while you were speaking. I was kind enough not to do that.
Sorry, Peter.
Thank you. I understand it's hard to have an open mind about this. It's very difficult for me when you realize that I wrote a book called Making Free Trade Work for the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's how I became a tenured full professor. But I have to recognize that some of these things haven't worked out as they should. And if I was sitting on a panel with Trumpsters, I'd be taking a very different approach. For example, it doesn't warm the cockles of my heart that they're taking aim at Mexico. Because in my view, the trade deficit with Mexico has a lot to do with the Mexicans doing smart things. For example, they have developed a network of trade agreements with other major trading partners, such as the Europeans, which permit them to be a very effective hub for manufacturing automobiles, for example, to be exported to all parts of the world without duties. Our problem with Mexico has been that they've been smarter than us about exploiting free trade in the ways the textbooks say they should. Our problems with China are the reverse. It's very easy to say in a world where you work on a blackboard and there are N countries with M factors and no one is very large, no one can influence prices by themselves, that the trade deficit with one country doesn't matter, or their industrial policies don't matter. And to say that, you know, the equilibrating process will raise incomes. There's a reason that elections have been coming out the way they have. And it's not just Trump's non-plurality victory. The Democrats, you know, have won or hold less than 20 of the governor's seats right now. Something's going on out there. The reality is the policy of the last two administrations has been to not do very much about Chinese mercantilism, but to provide social programs to compensate these people. And that has not proven enough. My friends on Wall Street who now will run this administration and will decide ultimately what our trade policy will be, Mr. Ross and Mr. Navarro will be adequately frustrated, I'm sure, by the Goldman Sachs crowd. I doubt that they've ever spent an afternoon dining outdoors the way they might in Manhattan, as my son does, in Reading, Pennsylvania, and looked at the prostitution, the boarded up windows, and the opioid abuse. But that is a real part of America that we don't see here in the rarefied confines of Washington or the wealth of New York and San Francisco. But labor market adjustments haven't worked in those places, and we have to ask why. We have to ask why, because it is a very mal-distributed outcome that is occurring. And my view is that this is not healthy, because we could slip into autarky, and I'm afraid that, you know, if some people in the administration had their way, we might. And that would not necessarily be a good thing either. But in order to discuss this, you can't constantly back down to tautologies and identities and not really address what it is that China actually does to particular markets in this country. Failure to do so is problematic. I know you want to respond.
Okay, I'm really struck by the fact at how little faulty trade policies on the part of the United States have been identified as the problem. I mean, with the exception of concerns of certain things about China, and yet the debate...
What did I just say about Mexico? Mexico has been very good at it.
No, what I'm saying is that the Trump dialogue or line is faulty trade policies on the part of the United States, and by that they mean tariff liberalization agreements. You're actually on the opposite side saying smart countries do more trade agreements. And no one here, other than talking a little bit about China, has said there's this whole decades-long failure of U.S. trade policy. But let Carolyn and Rob respond to your comments.
I just want to say I'm really concerned about blaming trade for the labor adjustment problems in the United States. So it is true, trade played a small part. So even if you take the study, which actually doesn't look at it at general equilibrium, it only looks at the effect of China directly on manufacturing, they find it's 17% of the total lost jobs since 2000. So more than 80% of the manufacturing jobs lost were for other reasons. And the reason I'm concerned about this is because it's so easy to blame the foreigner and not take any blame on ourselves and our own policies. The future of work is different. We have developed machines that do things differently. There are not jobs for the high school dropout or just high school educated who wants to go directly to a factory and is unskilled. Even in the manufacturing we do, look at the factories. There are people wearing these very protective suits because everything has to be done in a clean environment and they have to have some education to run the new types of machines. It is a different environment out there and we have to recognize this. But I'm really concerned about the xenophobic, it's all trade. Because it's so easy to blame foreigners, then it's not our own fault. And saying that adjustment, that the US has done so much adjustment and that's why people aren't in the labor force is absolutely insane. Europe does way more than what we do. That's why people don't object to trade in the way they do here. But we need to do adjustment for everything because otherwise trade and outsourcing take the brunt of the blame when really it's just the future of work is changing and we have to address this. I absolutely agree. We have to address that people are sitting on their couches and taking drugs. But partly they're taking drugs because they did back-breaking work for many years. We got rid of those jobs. That's a good thing. That is a good thing.
Okay, I'll give Rob a comment, then I'd like to go to Q's and A's from the audience.
Right, much of what I was going to say Carolyn has said, but I do want to make one other point. When Peter says, well, if you have a phenomenon, a bilateral trade deficit that costs someone their job, shouldn't you do something about that? Well, of course you should with labor policies, but that also fundamentally ignores the other side of it, which is to say that trade deficit represents the ability for American businesses and individuals to consume those goods at less cost than if they were manufactured here. And that allows them then to buy more things made by Americans or made by foreigners, which drives growth. This is to ignore all of the benefits of comparative advantage-driven trade is really provides, I think, a very partial and somewhat distorted picture.
Okay, thank you. I do want to go to questions and answers. So raise your hand. We've got